There have been some amazing fighters who have crossed over from other notable promotions into the UFC throughout its history, which have then expanded the UFC's roster's depth and their fan exposure immensely, starting all the way back in the 90s and early 2000s with the Pride era, where we had Mauricio Shogun Rua, Antonio Big Nog Nogueira, and of course Quinton Rampage Jackson coming through. And then we had the WEC and Strikeforce era, where we had Daniel Cormier, Jose Aldo, Ronda Rousey, and Dominick Cruz, just to name a few, come through, which then expanded to other major promotions like Bellator, where we had Eddie Alvarez, we had Michael Chandler and Michael Venom Page, and then Justin Gaethje from the World Series of Fighting, and Kayla Harrison recently from the PFL. And of course, those who transferred who have given us highlights for all the wrong reasons.
The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
And now we even have new faces in ex-Ryzen champion Kai Asakura, who's fighting for the Flyweight title straight off the bat against Alexandre Pantoja, and former double champion Reinier De Ridder from One Championship, who will hopefully bring a stronger grappling dimension to the middleweight division to ultimately improve it. So with that, what if we improved every single division? Let's look at the best signings the UFC could make in every single division. And kicking it off with the flyweight division, you're probably thinking Muhammad Mokaev, but someone who has paved their way after leaving the UFC and proving that they are one of the best in the world, which Mokaev hasn't done since leaving, it's gotta be Kyoji Horiguchi. Horiguchi is basically in his peak prime at the moment at 34 years old, so it's now or never that the UFC will actually sign him, and it would be such a resurgence for him and his career, because without Demetrius Johnson there submitting him in the last second of their fight, there's a strong chance Horiguchi could claim the UFC belt in the flyweight division. Since leaving the UFC back in 2016, he has gone 18-3-1 and is now 33-5. So he's taken out Manel Cap, Kai Asakura, and Sergio Pettis since, and has only lost by trading knockouts with Kai Asakura and getting beaten by Sergio Pettis, who he recently just avenged that loss against. And the only other one that is a straight loss is against Patchy Mix, which Patchy Mix is way bigger than him, 6 inches a reach longer, and 6 inches taller than him. And that fight was at bantamweight, and it was still competitive. It realistically could have gone to a 47-47 draw. So signing Kyoji Horiguchi would absolutely pump more Japanese talent into that division, because you got Tatsuro Taira and now we got Kai Asakura in there as well. So it's only going to reinvigorate the Japanese side of MMA and really push it through the UFC, which has the biggest audience. So that is where Kyoji, honestly, not even from a fighting standpoint, that is where it's just really good in terms of representing his nation. And back to him, since leaving the UFC, he has improved immensely. I mean, his speed and his movement were always very good, but his power and technical striking, and especially his grappling, has looked so much better since he's left the UFC. But most importantly, being 15-2 in the KO department now. This is a guy who has the capabilities of being able to take out the most durable fighters in the division, with the possibility of taking out guys like Brandon Moreno, taking out guys like Alexandre Pantoja even. So there is a clear entertainment factor and a very big what if factor if he can take those guys out. And that is what the flyweight division needs. It really needs the finishing capability there. And with this signing, that's really reinforced for the UFC. And Kyoji's linear and lateral movement just really allow him to pressure forward, land very fast, heavy combinations with his hooks and his strikes to the body as well. He really chops down opposition to the body, and his cardio and his speed just keep going, and that's where he's finishes have all come from. And in addition to that speed as well, I mean, he is one of the quickest in MMA, but with that speed on the back foot even, it allows him to counter so effectively while he's on the outside. So inside, outside, he's got the speed there to do both. Now, Kyoji hasn't been opposed to a UFC return, but it's been reported that the UFC haven't actually shown any interest in him. So if you're the UFC and you want someone who already has a marketable storyline in the UFC because of his loss to Demetrius Johnson, someone that has finishing capabilities both on the ground and on the feet, while also being able to spearhead Japan even further into relevance again in MMA, hurry up and sign Kyoji Horiguchi, please. Now, someone who we touched on in Kyoji Horiguchi's analysis, it's gotta be Patchy Mix. Patchy Mix is a very tall and long southpaw who is very similar in stature to Sean O'Malley, but is the polar opposite stylistically. He fights very similar to Aljamain Sterling, who's his training partner, because he absolutely loves to human backpack fighters, and he will push for submissions pretty much absolutely anywhere. He is definitely one of the most advanced ground game artists that just MMA has to offer at this point, to be honest, especially in the lower weight classes, because he is 20-1. He's never been finished, and he has finished 2 fights by KO TKO and 13 of them by submission. He is extremely silky with his level changes, whether it's single legs, double legs, or just obviously switching and riding the back. And when it gets to the ground, he is an absolute nightmare to deal with transitionally. He's very hard to just keep ahead of when it comes to that ground game, no matter where it is. And his ground and pound is quite controlled. He doesn't overextend himself there because he prefers the position over the submission realistically, especially if he is going to get put on his back by overextending with that ground and pound. So that's where he is a very much a safe fighter. But when he really tries to go for those submissions, there's submission threats everywhere. I mean, he's got 6 rear naked chokes, he's got 4 guillotines, he's got arm triangles, he's got knee bars, he's even got a Sulawev stretch against Isaiah Chapman. So the grappling arsenal can definitely match up to most of the UFC's bantamweight division without a doubt. And on the feet, he is extremely durable as well. He was hit with a lot of clean shots literally against Kyoji Horiguchi in their fight, piled on like 4-piece combinations on his head, and his head did not even move. Now that's all well and good when it comes to durability, but his head movement does need work, especially if he comes into the UFC and he's fighting guys like Davison Figueiredo and like Sean O'Malley that either have the striking accuracy and or the power there. And that's where it is a bit of an issue and a bit of a hole in his game, because he isn't the flashiest striker, but he has what he needs to play into his grappling based game. So he has pretty good jab on the feet, nice knees down the middle, and very clean counter striking, so he doesn't extend himself when he is striking. Otherwise he will get caught out because his head movement is just not that fantastic. That's why he has quite a rudimentary, just fundamental only striking base. And the only loss he has, being 20-1, is to Juan Archuleta back in 2020, which he did dominate the start of the fight, but then he gassed out later on in the fight, which, being that one cardio hole and his strike defense, the cardio is he's really made up for it since 2020, and he's looked a lot better, which he did against Kyoji Horiguchi for 5 rounds. So the only real flaw I can see here is that strike defense. And when it comes to him being signed by the UFC, the confidence is there. He firmly believes that he is the best. His style, though, isn't necessarily the most exciting for UFC standards, and he wonders why Sean O'Malley gets more recognition than him, and that's exactly why, because he doesn't have that striking finishing capability. But he would make very entertaining matchups against fighters like Umar Nurmagomedov and Merab Dvalishvili on the ground, and even Sean O'Malley, because that's actually a personal storyline there, because he respects Sean O'Malley, but he said that he would take take him out if he fought him. Now, the likelihood of him getting signed is there, but probably not for a while because he literally just renewed his Bellator contract at the start of this year. So there, it might take a bit of time to obviously get out of that contract, but if the UFC do decide to sign him, which I think is a good idea, he is definitely a ranked fighter. He would definitely be around that top 5 position, I strongly believe, just with the grappling arsenal that he has. And it will really showcase the strength of UFC's bantamweight division in comparison to everyone else's, because Patchy Mix, without a doubt, is the best bantamweight outside of the UFC. So for featherweight, this was between 2 for me. There's Aaron Pico, who definitely brings an entertainment factor with the KO threat that he does have. But Jesus Pinedo is the more accomplished and proven, who, just like Kyoji Horiguchi, he fought in the UFC before. He was 22 years old. He went 1-1 at lightweight in the UFC between 2018 and 2019. He beat David Powell on very short notice by decision, and then he fought John McDessie, who back then wasn't old and was much more experienced at the time, who he only lost to by a decision, which was competitive. He did actually perform fairly well, but then he was released from the UFC straight after that. Now, the reason why that was a mistake is because of his development after that, dropping down to featherweight. It has been immense. Pinedo has proceeded to go 7-1 since he was released from the UFC, with all 7 being by KO TKO. He's taken out the likes of Brendan Loughnane, who was a decent favorite against him, took him out with a very clean knee to the chin. He avenged his only loss as well to Gabriel Braga, which that was a controversial split decision in itself because he could have taken the last 2 rounds in that one. But then he went and KO'd him 2 fights later in the 3rd round. So it took Gabriel Braga's undefeated streak away, and he just got that win back anyway. So he's been pretty flawless so far. And when it comes to that, I mean, he is well-rounded. He's a finishing machine. In 23 fights, he's won 14 by KO and 4 by submission, and only losing 6 fights overall in his career, with 2 of those being by finish, which were when he was 18 years old. I mean, he's a pretty durable fighter. He is a very, very dangerous striker. I mean, the most notable part of Pinedo's game is his stature. He's 5'11", so he's like Max Holloway, but he has a 75-inch reach, which is behind Sean Woodson at 78 inches in the UFC from what I could honestly find. He's even with Edson Barboza. So he would add a very new physical dynamic near the top of the featherweight division that just a lot of those featherweights would have never seen before. And that is really credit in there because he has long range boxing like Sean Woodson, but mixing in that heavy KO threat that he does have with that kickboxing base. So he's not only extremely dangerous, he is extremely entertaining as well. He's very good at moving along the outside and utilizing the range that he has, but is also very vicious on the front foot. He mixes up his shots very well around the guard of his opponent when he is backing them up, and the knees down the middle are brutal. Obviously Loughnane felt that, and he just puts 4 to 5 piece combinations together when he's smelling blood. When he hurts someone and they get backed up, his combinations go crazy. Head, body, around the guard, everywhere. And that would honestly, with his style, it would make for a very exciting fight with guys like Diego Lopez, Giga Chikadze, and definitely like Lerone Murphy as well, these kickboxing oriented style fighters. And when it comes to the submission game, obviously being 4-0, he's got guillotine, he's got 2 triangles, and he's got an armbar as well. So he's definitely dangerous on the ground when it comes to wrestlers trying to keep him there like Aljamain Sterling and Movsar Evloev. They do have to be careful of that offensive ground game from his back that he does have. But I will say, even though his durability is very good, his strike defense is not the greatest, especially with checking leg kicks. Not good at that at all. And against guys like Volkanovski and like Barboza, that could really trouble him in those kind of fights. But ultimately, having Pinedo back in the UFC with the improvements that he's made and how he stylistically fights, he would without a doubt be a spearhead for Peruvian MMA because he is the first Peruvian MMA champion in history. But having that in the UFC would just inflate that so much because it would not only allow himself but his country as well to get so much exposure, and especially the fighters from Peru to have hope in terms of fighting on the biggest stage. And not only that, in terms of spearheading his country, I mean, the fans getting to see him fight, the way he fights on the feet and the output that he brings, very entertaining addition to the UFC roster. And there hasn't been any word of him actually joining the UFC again, but with the way that he has been fighting in the PFL, he just needs the exposure from the UFC to really honestly become an elite fighter. He can hang with a lot of fighters at 145 in the UFC, which I believe he definitely does have something to offer there and would give the UFC more reason to actually host more South American events with more top fighters like him coming out of there. So it would just honestly, it would just be a great opportunity for the UFC to get another entertaining striker as well as someone to spearhead a country that is lacking in MMA at the moment. Now moving on to lightweight, this one is pretty clear to say because it has not changed from the thumbnail. We need Khabib's cousin slash Umar Nurmagomedov's younger brother, Usman Nurmagomedov, to be signed to the UFC. And this is extremely likely, probably the most likely one on this list to actually happen because he's publicly came out and said that he actually wants to join the UFC in 2 years' time when he is 28 years old.
Теперь спишь с мыслью о поясе UFC после ислама?
Да, жду, когда он закончит, если честно.
Ну, я и говорю,
Сейчас еще...
цель одна осталась-то, в принципе, да?
Я думаю, если 28 мы залетим, я думаю, с 28 до 32, 26. 2 года еще окрепнуть и 28 залететь до 32, до 33.
So Islam either would have retired by then or he would have moved up to welterweight by then. So there's no choking in that lightweight division once Usman gets there. And with Usman being the next generation of the Nurmagomedovs, yes, he is undefeated. He is 18-0. He's got 8 KOs. He's got 6 submissions, and those submissions mainly consist of chokes. But when we look at his KOs, it's the most important thing. Obviously, he trains out at AKA with Islam, and he is trained obviously with Umar and Khabib and Javier Mendez. And Javier Mendez has stated that this guy is the most talented fighter that he has ever trained, Khabib included. And Usman, when it comes to the feet, he is like a hybrid version of Islam Makhachev and Umar Nurmagomedov, as he uses like spinning kicks like Umar and knees up the middle a lot like Islam, and he's just very, very kick heavy. He loves front kicks, he loves the spinning kicks, he loves oblique kicks, and just a whole arsenal of kicks. I mean, he has a very strong kickboxing, pretty much a base at this point, but obviously the staple base that we know he has is the Sambo style wrestling, which he, just like any of the others, can smother anyone when it comes to the ground. But can he do it well in the UFC? Granted, he hasn't fought as good opponents as Islam Makhachev and is behind him at this point. He can definitely do well in the UFC. There's just no question about it. I mean, he's only 26 years old. He has some of the most versatile striking techniques, both close range and at long range as well, that most of the top fighters in lightweight in the UFC don't have, because a lot of those fighters in the UFC at lightweight, like Poirier, like Max Holloway, any of those kind of guys, they're just very boxing oriented. When we look at Islam fight in a kickboxing state, I mean, he is finding so much success. I mean, the only ones that are really comparable in that regard are Fiziev and Gaethje. There's not really many others, maybe Dan Hooker as well. But then the ground game with the Sambo outclasses most of those fighters anyway. So long story short, in true Nurmagomedov fashion, this guy could honestly be a champion at 155 pounds in the UFC in a few years, without a doubt. They're just really aren't many holes to his game offensively or defensively. It's just simply the experience level isn't on his side at this point, but that is obviously going to come. And there's only one borderline blemish we have seen in his career, which is against Brent Primus, which he won very convincingly in that fight, but it was ruled as a no contest due to testing positive for a banned substance. Now, the banned substance was actually from prescription medication that he took, so it's not really worth the mention here. So regardless, I mean, we look at the Nurmagomedovs, they have so much stock just through Khabib and through the UFC. It's just an absolute no-brainer that he is going to get signed from the UFC in the next few years. Now, welterweight was one of the toughest ones on this list to actually pick because we have a bunch of good fighters literally out of Bellator alone that I could have picked. We got Ramzan Khmagomedov, we got Jason Jackson, and we got Yaroslav Amosov as well. And realistically, the most notable one, which is from the PFL, is Cedric Doumbé, but he isn't the biggest fan of the UFC because he got snubbed for his debut a couple years back, and then the PFL picked him up and he just has not looked back since. But these picks can't just be the best fighters, you know, I can't just pick them just because I think they're the best and they should just slot in. They need to be fighters that the UFC can actually feasibly sign. And that's where I'm straying away from both PFL and Bellator and heading over to One Championship, where the UFC need to sign Christian Lee. And in terms of feasibility for Christian Lee's future, it's actually uncertain at One Championship, but it actually was uncertain for MMA as a career for quite a while, because sadly his younger sister, Victoria Lee, fellow fighter, did actually take her own life, and he then was on a 2-year hiatus as a result of that. So he hasn't actually fought since 2022, but he has, however, recently stated that he would come back to competition to fight for his family's legacy, which is looking like he'll fight another welterweight fight either later in this year or next year. And honestly, it would be great to have him back, as he had one of the greatest careers under 25 years old in MMA history. I mean, he's only recently turned 26 years old, and he has fought in 3 different divisions. He's fought at 155 pounds, 170 obviously, and 185 pounds, and has claimed double champ status in both lightweight and welterweight. And a lot of people believe he is best suited for lightweight, which I understand, but his last 7 fights have technically been at welterweight, with one of those being at middleweight, which One Championship structure of weight classes when it comes to actual weight is kind of all over the place, to be honest. So technically he is actually a welterweight, and that's where he naturally fights. Now, he's 17-4 with 12 KOs and 4 by submission, and he's only been finished once ever, which was by a submission when he was 18 years old. So he's extremely talented for his age. He's very strong, very fast, and he can either pressure forward with his hand speed or shoot straight in to grab a body lock. And he just, when he gets a body lock, he just ragdolls his opponents to the ground. He's very, very strong. And even on the back foot, he has a really fast check left hook, and he's got very decent takedown defense as well, along with submission defense. I mean, when he fought Shin Aoki, the armbar was ridiculously tight and he was able to get out of it. And just like Usman Nurmagomedov, he's 26 years old, and it's really hard to find holes in his game. He's not as versatile with his weapons on the feet as someone like Usman Nurmagomedov, but he carries more raw power. But just like Usman, in terms of a slight con, it's the experience of the opposition, in addition with him specifically, the mental struggles with the hiatus, means that he could come back a completely different fighter. But judging off the Christian Lee we had before, because that's what we really have to do, if the UFC get the chance, especially at welterweight, he must be signed. And this is primarily down to having that very heavy boxing, just striking based approach with guaranteed knockout ability. And a wrestle heavy UFC welterweight division at the moment is severely lacking that. And having him in there just brings so much potential to that division. His pros just really outweigh the cons. The fact that he is a double champion before 25, he just ticks all the boxes for the UFC. Entertaining, got a lot of power, not many holes. He will have a lot of time to grow in the UFC. I mean, this is someone that really needs to be picked up, especially with his future at one championship not being so clear. And I mean, when we look at him stylistically specifically, he's got the power through his boxing, he's got head kicks, he's extremely aggressive, he's got really good cardio as well, and his chin is made of bloody steel. He's 12-0 with KOs, and there's really not much this guy can't do. And if he can get signed in a few more years, once he's hitting that peak prime, I don't see why he can't challenge for the welterweight title, without a doubt. I mean, his technical striking is clean enough to hang with a lot of the UFC's welterweights right now, and his strength will be very interesting combating wrestlers like Sean Brady and even guys like Kamaru Usman if they're around at that point. So the UFC should let him get his momentum back through one championship, and if he continues to perform to that standard, snatch him up, because he is an absolute problem. Now in middleweight, this is probably the most feasible one on the list next to Usman Nurmagomedov, and that is Johnny Eblen, who has been eyeing the UFC for a while and will be a free agent next year, as he's been under Bellator and has now taken over PFL as well. So it's really the last stop for him. And Johnny Eblen has worked very closely with a lot of UFC fighters because he trains at American Top Team. And that means he even trains with fighters like Bo Nickel and Marvin Vettori at that gym, but he's also trained through Extreme Couture with Sean Strickland. So there are a lot of close connections there pushing him towards the UFC, and he has shown peak interest in fighting Dricus du Plessis.
I have better boxing than him. I'm cleaner with my defense, cleaner with my strikes. I'm technically a better wrestler. Like, I've wrestled since the age of 4, and like, he's kind of like a big athletic guy that's like learned how to grapple, learned how to wrestle. I've been doing it since I was a young kid. You know, I know how to flow with guys like Bo Nickel, and like, I'm a college wrestler, but I can strike and I can grapple. So I have the full package, bro. And I feel like he does too, but I'm just a step above him.
Now, would he perform well against Dricus or just in the UFC in general? I mean, he's not a highlight finisher by any means. He's got 6 finishes by KO and 1 by submission, and he's got 10 decisions. However, he is undefeated in his career, and he has also fought pretty experienced opposition. He fought Gegard Mousasi, he fought Impa Kasanganay, and finished Fabian Edwards in their first fight. And Eblen, stylistically, is very good in both stances. He uses his fundamentals very, very well. He doesn't use heavy combinations, and he consistently times kicks to all areas, as well as utilizing boxing very well. And this style is very similar to Patchy mix, because he doesn't overextend in his game. And that's because he loves to get his fights to the ground and control heavily with his wrestling. And that's the key for him and his opportunity in the UFC to really seize it, because he's a relentless wrestler with insane cardio, basically making him a middleweight Marab with very, very good recovery, which, opposite to like the striking of Christian Lee in a wrestle heavy welterweight division, a wrestle heavy Johnny Eblen is a great fit in a striking heavy middleweight UFC division. I mean, moving into middleweight, especially now, he could definitely be a top 5 fighter, I firmly believe, because his fight IQ is some of the best we have at the moment, and that wrestling stylistically on top of it is just a recipe for a lot of problems for a lot of those fighters in the middleweight division. I mean, he could match up very interestingly against Israel Adesanya, Sean Strickland with the striking, and then Brendan Allen and Anthony Hernandez on the ground, and so many more fighters in there. And ultimately, the time is now, because he's 32, he's in his prime, he wants to be signed. 2025, UFC, give the middleweight division some more depth, especially stylistically. And touching on one of Johnny Eblen's former opponents who he almost lost his undefeated streak against, it is none other than Impa Kasanganay, who dropped and hurt Eblen multiple times in the second round of their fight. And let me tell you, Impa He has had a pretty crazy story. I mean, he's come through the regional scene at the start of his career, gone into Dana White's Contender Series as an 8-0 fighter, and then he runs into Joaquin Buckley and is on the receiving end on one of the best KOs in MMA history. And to add insult to injury, I mean, he was cut shortly after that. But then, after the UFC, he went 9-2 with almost all of his wins being by finish, and he has still not been finished since leaving the UFC. And in that time, he moved up from middleweight and has definitely found his home at light heavyweight. So Impa is currently 8-0 at light heavyweight and has only lost once at light heavyweight, if we want to get really specific, back in 2018 against Brian Battle as an amateur. So as a pro, he is flawless at light heavyweight, and he's very light on the feet. He's got great speed translation moving up in that weight class, as well as his cardio. He's not so drawn out. His cardio just doesn't have problems. He doesn't really gas. And even with the 75-inch reach, which is kind of naturally a bit shorter in light heavyweight, he doesn't really have many problems because he sticks a very nice jab. He's got the hand speed. He's got very nice head movement as well. And off that head movement, he uses very nice clean check hooks. And honestly, I think when he lets his hands go, he's as fast as Khalil Roundtree at light heavyweight. He is very quick. And speaking of Khalil Roundtree, that would make for a very fun matchup along with many others in that division. And he's 30 years old now and in his prime. I mean, he's found great success in the PFL. He's really just resurged his career, but there is just no better time for him to come back to the UFC because his success in the PFL has put him on notice to the point where when Joaquin Buckley fights, they talk about Impa's success since Joaquin Buckley decapitated him. I mean, that is an amazing storyline just to really come back to through the UFC, to go full circle and to really show, especially at light heavyweight. Obviously, you won't get a rematch or anything with Joaquin Buckley because they are two divisions apart, but it just really shows that that development that he's had and just that resurgence, he can hang with the best of the best, which the UFC obviously have. And understandably, he is in no rush to return to the UFC because he is getting the big bucks. But he did state that he is open to it, and I could see him securing a ranking position this time around.
Anywhere God sends me, I'll go. That's my prayer. It's like, I don't stress, man. I love it, man. I really do love being part of people, and I love staying active. That's where God has me. That's where God has me. God sent me to the UFC. God sent me to the UFC, and I'll dominate anywhere. I'll be champion there too.
Or possibly go further into the rankings in the next few years, because guys like Alex Pereira and a couple other fighters in that division are getting older, and within about 2 years' time, when he is in his peak prime, they are starting to fade out. So for not only added storylines, but to add to an always struggling light heavyweight division, it seems, I hope this one gets done ASAP, even if it's just ultimately fun. I think it would be a great signing to really just get Impa back. Now, lastly, in the men's divisions, I honestly would have gone with one championship's triple champion, Anatoly Malikin, but he will not leave one championship and he will definitely retire there. So it's just honestly not feasible, and he is not getting any younger. He's about 37 to 38 years old now. But someone who is in their prime age range that would also be great to see is Vadim Nemkov. Nemkov is 18-2 at this point with 10 KOs, 4 submissions, and 1 loss by a decision, and 1 by a technical stoppage all the way back in 2015 in his early 20s against none other than Yuri Prochazka, which was a competitive fight, but it was a 10-minute round, and he just completely blew his gas tank and he quit on the stool, he quit on the canvas. So there is a bit of quitter mentality, which I've seen in the MMA space about him, but 2015, early 20s, he's only lost once since then. This guy seriously has evolved greatly since that point. I mean, he's taken out guys like Phil Davis, Ryan Bader, Corey Anderson, and he's even beaten Yoel Romero. And Nemkov is not a big heavyweight, but I'd say he's around the size of like a prime Stipe Miocic, which makes him very fast on the feet, and not only moving, but with the hand speed. He weighs in at about in between 235 and 245 pounds at heavyweight, But joining the UFC, it can be a versatile signing because he can fight both at light heavyweight and heavyweight, which we could then see a rematch between him and Yuri, which would be great for the both of them, especially Yuri and what he's going through right now with Alex Pereira. And Nemkov has ultimately been able to just deal enough damage, but with the speed to really make the difference in most of his matchups. And that's including UFC matchups that we will potentially have, especially at heavyweight. Because if he joins the UFC at heavyweight, he would easily be a top 10 fighter. And with its lack of depth, I can honestly see a top 5 or possibly a title shot in there as well. Because I can see him beating absolutely anyone in the division except obviously your John Joneses and your Tom Aspinalls, and possibly your Volkovs, maybe your Pavlovich and your Cyril Gans. I think those 3 are feasible, but less likely. Now, John Jones, obviously he will be retiring, and Volkov, I don't know how much time he has left either. So it's really hard to say because he has ultimately only had 1 fight at heavyweight, and he choked out PFL champion Bruno Capoloza, which was a very good arm triangle. I mean, he looked great at heavyweight. Speed translation was on point. I mean, he ate shots very well. I mean, his straights, his 1-2s down the pipe were great as well. I mean, his versatile kicking game was there, and he's just got that power. I mean, he looks great at heavyweight as a lighter one. And as a side note, and an important one, Vadim Nemkov is Fedor Emelianenko's protege. And Fedor was, without a doubt, the #1 most elusive fighter that the UFC was never able to snatch up. So the marketability of Nemkov just from the storyline with Fedor in his corner at a UFC event is without a doubt made him worth signing to the UFC. I mean, he would get a great amount of exposure. He would ultimately be successful in the heavyweight division because the technical capabilities that he has on the ground and the feet, in contrast to a pretty weak UFC heavyweight division, he would do a lot of damage there, without a doubt. And I mean, he's only got a couple years left, but I honestly think sign him up now and make it count. I mean, even if he chose to drop to light heavyweight, I mean, it's a versatile signing and he could find success there as well. So either way, I think this is a great signing for the UFC and for Nemkov to solidify himself. Now, moving on to the women's weight classes in strawweight, I've got to go with Nong Stamp, aka Stamp Fairtex. Now, granted, it will be difficult for the UFC to get this across the line because she is a massive star in Asia and in one championship, of course. But if the UFC are at all serious about making an atomweight division, Fairtex is a crucial piece of the puzzle, as well as being able to fight at strawweight as well, because one championship being weird with their weight classes, atomweight is actually 115 pounds, which is strawweight in the UFC. So I ultimately don't think that this will happen, but there is a chance, obviously. But the amount of pros it would bring if they did, I mean, she would open up the Asian market so much more. She would spearhead a completely new division in atomweight and would greatly push women's MMA further with the worldwide exposure of UFC. And I'm telling you, an atomweight division would be a hell of a lot better than the bloody women's featherweight division that they had, because you can just feed a lot of Thai kickboxers in there who are on the smaller side and have a lot of fast-paced fights. It would just be just a more entertaining division to make. So with that, if they're trying to get more on the roster and they need an atomweight division, this is the girl to get it across the line. But looking at strawweight, which is where we are pointing this out at 115 pounds, Stamp has fought there a lot in her career and she translates there very well. I mean, she has very nice stand-up, classic Muay Thai base coming out of Thailand, very nice kicks, very fast kicks to the body, clinch knees, very nice, and her elbows as well. Just a very developed game. And not only that, in terms of the last couple years, her transitional game on the ground has actually developed very well, and that is inclusive of her submission offense, which is pretty good. She does hunt arm bars, but more importantly is her submission defense. She's gotten out of some pretty bad situations, and that is credit to her grittiness. She just does not stop trying to get out of those positions and knows what to do when she tries to get out of those positions, and she succeeds in doing so. Now, fighters like Stamp who can make it just a complete dogfight That's what women's MMA needs on the biggest stage. Having someone that can make it a dogfight but simultaneously make it technical at the same time, that just shows that pretty much none of her fights are boring, and she's 27 years old, so she's still got time. She doesn't have boring fights, and we need grittier fighters in women's MMA, and she's someone that can do it. And not only that, she can have Thailand breakthrough into the UFC more so, which is a huge market, and also opens up a whole new division. There's just so many pros to getting Sam Fairtex. Yes, it is going to be difficult and it might not happen for a few years, but if there is any possibility for the UFC to do so, snatch her up, because it will be worth it. And in flyweight women's, get Dakota Ditcheva over to the UFC as soon as possible. This is an absolute must, because everything I have ever said about what is needed to make women's MMA fights not boring is to sign Dakota Ditcheva. She ticks all the boxes in women's MMA, and to improve it. She's got very clean and technical striking with KO power along with it. She is undefeated with 12 finishes in 13 fights. She has pretty much mauled all of her opponents. And granted, they aren't the best opponents, but if she cleans up Tyler Santos at the end of the month, UFC have got to cough up the money to PFL to get her, just like they got Kayla Harrison. Because even though the difference is that the flyweight division is more stacked and is the best division compared to bantamweight where Kayla Harrison is, it just doesn't matter, because getting more technical finishes, it's the blueprint to having women's MMA being taken more seriously. Dakota Ditcheva fits that bill perfectly, and that is completely feasible to actually get her without a doubt, because similar to Johnny Eblen, she is surrounded by fighters like Kayla Harrison, like Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and all the male fighters that are in American Top Team. They all train at the same gym. So there is a lot of talk about hyping her up to transition into the UFC. And she has clearly proven her worth of getting into the UFC. She's a switch stance fighter, very light on the feet, and she has a very long frame as well. And she generates a lot of power. And look, if her opponents can safely close the distance, there's a knee right there for them. And staying on the outside is just a death wish at this point for her, because she has just knocked out absolutely everyone except for 2 people, which one of them she submitted. So it's even showing more depth to her game in that regard. And when it's on the feet, what makes her so dangerous is the fluidity in her movement. She just times her strikes very well, and the strike accuracy is the complete success for her. That is what has got her where she is today. And ultimately, compared to 95% of the fighters on the UFC roster, of the women's roster, her striking, that arsenal that she has eclipses pretty much all of them. I think she is pretty much on par with like Valentina Shevchenko and Manon Fior when it comes to that striking department. And looking at the ground game, her offensive threat is pretty much unknown. As I said, she does have the one rear naked choke, but with the training partners that she has, she gets to work her takedown defense endlessly at American Top Team, because they're all there's just such a heavy wrestling based gym, and her takedown defense has been fantastic so far. There's not really much to critique on it, and maintaining her balance when she's on one leg. So it's very difficult when fighters are trying to shoot in for takedowns, because she just has great balance, or she knows how to scoop the underhooks, control the wrist, and obviously widen and lowering her base. So that is where there's just improvement after improvement. It is definitely impressive. If we're getting a 100% finish rate striker in women's MMA, borderline 100%, I mean, the UFC just has to sign them immediately. You don't even have to say their name. We just need whoever that is immediately, and that at the moment is Dakota Ditcheva. So UFC needs to sign her as soon as possible. Now, lastly, with bantamweight women's, this is a very controversial one, just simply down to the point that Larissa Pacheco is the one that I'm picking, and she is a fantastic fighter, but is she able to make the weight? Because aside from her, unless we want cans signed in the UFC that are going to do nothing at the top flight of the division, then we don't have anything. There's really no one else. So if you guys can leave a comment if I have missed anyone, can you please let me know for the women's bantamweight division? Because I'm stuck here. The women's bantamweight division is in trouble after signing Kayla Harrison, because that's about it. Now, looking at Larissa Pacheco, She has fought at bantamweight about 5 times in her career. So there is a feasibility, there's feasibility there. Otherwise I'll just put no one here. But she went 3-2, and this was quite a long time ago as well. So she went 3-2. She had the 2 losses coming in the UFC. So she's fought in the UFC before. She lost to Jessica Andrade by submission and Jermaine Durandamy by KO TKO. So both times that she has only ever been finished have been in the UFC. So she could definitely have, just like Impa, just like Kyoji Horiguchi, she could have a real redemption kind of story if she does get signed here and if she can make that weight. Now, that being obviously is not completely unfeasible to happen because Kayla Harrison is similar in stature to her and she's making 135. But speaking of Kayla Harrison, she is the one that has handed Kayla Harrison her only loss. And when it comes to handing Kayla Harrison a loss, she is clearly UFC caliber. I mean, she's only lost to Kayla Harrison in the first 2 fights and has lost to Chris Cyborg recently. And then plus those UFC losses that she has, she's only lost to top competition. Literally everyone that she has lost to is still ranked at the moment. So she is a high caliber fighter. She is very good. She would easily fight for a title at 135 pounds in the UFC because she's an absolute bulldozer. She has finished 19 out of 23 of her wins. 11 of those are by KO and 8 are by submission. And her stand-up's pretty straightforward. I mean, her hands basically are like, her right hand especially is basically Pereira's left hook, but just translate it to women's MMA. It just literally just kills everyone. And she has the ability to submit from pretty much any point. She hits arm bars, anacondas, key locks, guillotines, triangles, pretty much anything, you name it, she can hit it. Now, Kayla or Amanda Nunes, they are the only 2 that could beat her, realistically. She sparks absolutely everyone else. Everyone else in that division. Norma Dumont might give her a little bit of a run for her money, but aside from that, everyone gets killed. So it is a one-sided kind of transfer in that sense, but if Amanda Nunes comes back, it really gives some more depth to that division, but that's really what we're riding on at this point. If Pacheco can somehow manage to make weight at 135, because she fights at 145 and sometimes 155 pounds, which is ridiculous. It's very, very difficult to find a signing for this division. Now, she's 30 years old, so there obviously is time within her prime. Now, if she can make that weight, it's just going to be harder as age and time goes on. So there is a possibility. There is a very slight chance it could happen, and I would love it if it did. But the likelihood of it, it's probably a no-go. But if there's anyone that I have missed out on, please leave a comment below so I can actually analyze them. Hope you enjoyed today's hot take video, and if you want to see more MMA based content, definitely check out the video that I've just got on the screen, and please like, comment and subscribe. It really goes a long way for the channel, and I will catch you in the next one.